Good morning. Today we're going to be starting a new series, working through the minor prophets in the Old Testament. We're going to be starting with the first one, and that's Hosea. So if you want to start turning there, we're going to work through, Lord willing, chapters 1 through 3 of Hosea this morning. So this actually comes at a pretty good time to do this, because last week, and when we were talking about what we were talking about for Mother's Day, Hannah, we started out with some history of sort of God's unbroken plan and story between Him and mankind. And so that history was important for us to understand the context of what we were talking about last week. And I think before we start Hosea, we need to have some understanding of history as well. And so we can pick up where some of those details left off. So last week we worked through from the time of creation up until this interesting time of transition in the nation of Israel, where they moved from being a tribalistic society to a nation that had a king. And we talked about the first two kings in Israel. There was King Saul, who was problematic, and then we saw that after God rejected King Saul, he rose up David to take his place, and Israel finally had the king that they needed. And that's kind of where we were working through last week to set the stage for Samuel's story and Hannah's, even more importantly. But with this in mind, now we can sort of look at the the next steps after that. So we had Saul, then we had David. David had a son named Solomon who became king after him. And as much as David was turned out to be a great king for the people, Solomon was even better. Solomon was probably the greatest king of all times, and under him the nation flourished economically. There was peace. It was just a wonderful time in Israel's history. And then Solomon had a son named Rehoboam who took over the throne after him, and Rehoboam, unfortunately, was nothing like his father. He was an atrocious king. He was tyrannical. He raised taxes through the roof. He divided the nation, and actually the kingdom fractured, and wound up breaking off into two different kingdoms. And so what you've got here on the screen is what the kingdom looked like from the time of Rehoboam and a while after. The green part at the top, that was the northern kingdom. It's called the Kingdom of Israel. There were 10 tribes who were up in the northern kingdom, and sort of this bluish purple, or whatever you call it, area on the map on the bottom, that's the southern kingdom. That's the kingdom of Judah. Right? So Israel breaks into these two kingdoms, Israel to the north, Judah to the south, and in the south it's just Judah and Benjamin. So that's what happened. All right? And for the purposes of what we're talking about this morning, we have to recognize that the nation breaking into two different nations caused a problem. And if you remember back when we were working through the Passion Week, we said a big part of that focus, or a lot that revolved around that story, is the fact that if you were an Israelite, if you were a child of God back in those days, in Old Testament times, you were biblically required to travel to Jerusalem to make a certain sacrifice at the time of the Passover. Right? You had to do that. You had to go to the temple there and do that thing. And so once the nation breaks into two different nations, then you've got an issue, because here's Jerusalem right here at the northern top. It's at the top of the kingdom of Judah, but now the northern kingdom doesn't have Jerusalem in it at all. And so the people were still required to go down there, but the king at the time, that was one of Solomon's servants, a guy named Jeroboam, he didn't want his people going down to the southern kingdom to sacrifice. I don't know if he was worried they wouldn't come back, or if there was some power structure issue. I'm not sure what his heart was there, but he didn't want his people going down to Jerusalem to make these sacrifices. And so what he did instead, he set up two altars in the northern kingdom where people could make sacrifices. There was one at a place called Bethel, right here at the southern tip of the kingdom, and sort of conveniently, the other one was in a city called Dan, which is right up here at the top. And so what he said is, everybody in the kingdom, they should go to these places to make the sacrifice. And logistically, we can kind of understand that, but the problem is, biblically, Jeroboam did not have the authority to do that. right? The people were still accountable to God to go and make their sacrifices in Jerusalem, and so he was preventing them from following the Lord. And to make things worse, when he set up these altars as an alternative place to make these sacrifices, he set them up with these golden calf idols in them. So essentially they looked just like pagan altars where people were worshiping idols in the world around them. And so this became a really big issue, and the nation almost immediately began blending their worship of God with worship of other gods as well. And so they wound up being in this strange place where they had one foot in Old Testament times and worshiping God and following him, but the other foot was planted firmly in paganism, and everything went downhill very quickly. The Bible talks about this problem of following God but also following idols. It uses a word picture here, describes it as the people were committing spiritual adultery. They were cheating on God with other gods. And so that's sort of the image of adultery is used throughout the Bible in different parts to describe this problem or this sin of idolatry. And so the solution to this is God started sending a series of prophets to go to the people and warn them and say, hey, this thing you're doing, this is a problem. This is not going to end well. You need to stop doing this. Hosea was one of these prophets that God sent to the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, to deliver this message. At the time that Hosea was sent and was doing his ministry, Israel was economically thriving. Things were going very well for them. They were like this cosmopolitan area that people like to go to, and from a worldly perspective, they were doing very well. But the problem is, because of their idolatry, they were actually rotten to the core. And so Hosea goes to deliver God's message, but God asks him or commands him to deliver this message in a very unusual way, and that's what we're going to talk about this morning. All right, Hosea chapter 1. We'll just start with verse 1 here. The word of the Lord came to Hosea, son of Beeri, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the reign of Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, king of Israel. So all this is doing is just triangulating for us the time period when Hosea had his ministry. It was a tumultuous time, right? Somebody would become king. A month later, they'd get taken out. Somebody else would be king. A year later, someone would kill them. It was a pretty crazy time in their history, but this tells us when it took place. Now here's where the unusual and sort of uncomfortable message comes in. Verse 2, when the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, go, marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her, for like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord. So verse 2 here, God tells Hosea to go, and I'm reading from the New International Version. It said, marry a promiscuous woman. If you're following along in the King James or in one of the Pew Bibles, the New American Standard, it would be translated as a wife of harlotry or a wife of whoredom. And as we continue reading, we realize that I think this particular English translation, we've kind of euphemized it a little bit, and God has actually told Hosea to marry a prostitute. And this is kind of uncomfortable and it's kind of strange, but what we're seeing here is God is telling Hosea to go and perform like an action sermon. Right? Don't deliver the message with just words. He has him go and do something instead, and it's something that we find to be very unpleasant or very uncomfortable, but there you go. And so I was trying to think, well, what's a good illustration of this, or what's a good comparison? And then I thought about this. I had to look this one up. Mark chapter 9, verse 35. Jesus there in that verse tells his disciples that they must serve one another. I know we'd said that a number of times, but I couldn't have told you that was in Mark 9:35. But if you remember when we worked through the Last Supper, the events there just a few weeks ago, we saw Jesus say the very same thing, and then he got down on his knees and he washed his disciples' feet. Oh, you never forget that. Right? That's something that just is burned indelibly in our minds. We remember that action sermon that Jesus did. And so I would say Mark 9:35 or Jesus washing his disciples' feet. Which of those two things do you remember? If you're like me, it's probably the latter. And so that's what's going on here with Hosea. When God tells Hosea to do this thing, this is a powerful message that God is putting out there. There's this picture, like we said, of Israel adopting idolatry. It's the same kind of thing, same kind of picture as Hosea marrying a prostitute. And so God has Hosea go and live this out before the people. Verses 3 through 9 takes on a whole other layer here. It says, "So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to Hosea, 'Call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel.' Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. Then the Lord said to Hosea, 'Call her Lo Ruhamah, which means not loved, for I will no longer show love to Israel, that I should at all forgive them. Yet I will show love to Judah, and I will save them, not by bow, sword, or battle, or by horses and horsemen, but I, the Lord their God, will save them.' After she had weaned Lo Ruhamah, Gomer had another son. Then the Lord said, 'Call him Lo Ami, which means not my people, for you are not my people, and I am not your God.'" All right, so not only does God have Hosea marry a prostitute, he has Hosea marry this woman, they have a few children, and then God says each time one of these children is born, you need to name them a certain thing, and each of these names are significant, they're meaningful, they are prophecies of judgment coming as a result of what Israel has been doing. And the first was a son named Jezreel, and what the backstory there tells us a little bit here, but elsewhere in the Bible we can read the story that God had gone to a man named Jehu and told him to attack Jezreel, but then Jehu got kind of carried away and went too far and ran amok, and so he had sinned greatly, and God had said here that there was a blood debt that needed to be settled. Revenge is the Lord's. And so what we see here, when he is told to name his first son Jezreel, when Hosea is told to name his first son Jezreel, we see two prophecies in verse 4. One, that there's going to be punishment coming to Jehu for the massacre. And two, God pronounces there will be an end to the northern kingdom. And us today have the luxury of being able to look back in history and the rest of Scripture that's written later, and we see that indeed both of these prophecies have come true. In 752 BC, Zechariah was killed. He was the great-great-grandson of Jehu. And when that happened, that blood debt was satisfied, and it also marked the end of that family dynasty. That wiped out that family dynasty entirely, just as was prophesied here in Hosea chapter 1, verse 4. And of course, we know that the end of the northern kingdom, that prophecy was also fulfilled in 724 BC. God had them cease to be a kingdom anymore. The second child, a daughter, Lo Ruhamah, means unloved. It means unpitied. Discipline is kind of what we're seeing here. God has this pronouncement, this prophecy of a coming discipline on the nation, the kingdom of Israel. And previously, we read the rest of our Bibles here, up until now, God had just showered his love down on the people of Israel, didn't he? I mean, he brought them out of Egypt, he parted the Red Sea, he caused manna to fall from the sky, water flowed from rocks, God gave them the 10 Commandments, he sustained them. God just shows love after event showing love after event showing love. But the people still rebelled against him, and that's the story of the Israelites, and it's our story as well. But now, with this pronouncement of this daughter's name, Lo Ruhamah, we have a prophecy that God is going to withdraw his love. He's going to withdraw his mercy from the nation. And indeed, we know that is fulfilled as well. The people are scattered, as we'd already said. 724, their army is defeated. 722, they're completely conquered, and the people are scattered. The third child, another son, Lo Ami, which means not my people. And so we see from this third prophecy that God's not just going to withdraw his mercy from the people, he's going to disown them. He's going to sever ties with them. This is a picture of divorce. This is a picture of a father rejecting his son, and we know this has come true as well. God has put the nation on a shelf, we say. But after these three prophecies, right, after this just very difficult thing, we have verses 10 through chapter 2, verse 1. Yet the Israelites will be like the sand on the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In the place where it was said to them, "You are not my people," they will be called children of the living God. The people of Judah and the people of Israel will come together. They will appoint one leader and will come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. Say of your brothers, "My people," and of your sisters, "My loved one." It's what we see here after these very difficult and very brutal prophecies. All hope is not lost. God says he's not going to abandon his people forever. And we get these amazing prophecies for the future as well. And we see in this prophecy about the future, the names change. "Not my people" gets changed back to "my people." "Unloved" becomes "my loved one." And the significance of Jezreel changes. Started out as this place of great sin and cause for discipline and cause for God's retribution, but it changes here with this wonderful picture of restoration. It says, "Great will be the day of Jezreel." Now we know, looking back, that those first three prophecies of judgment, those first three prophecies of discipline, those have come true. We're at this neat time in history where we can look back and see, yeah, this stuff has already been fulfilled. But this prophecy of restoration, that has yet to be fulfilled. We talked about that quite a bit in our study of Romans. That's something we are looking forward to, something that's going to happen in the future. But we have prophecy, fulfillment of prophecy, and prophecy that has yet to be fulfilled. So that's Hosea chapter 1. Now, Hosea chapter 2, this is going to cover much the same ground that chapter 1 did, and we're just going to read some selections from the chapter here, but it walks through the same kind of thing. We have judgment, and then we have this amazing picture of redemption here. So chapter 2, just verse 2, "Rebuke your mother, rebuke her, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband." Skip down to verse 4, "I will not show my love to her children, because they are the children of adultery. Their mother has been unfaithful and has conceived them in disgrace." So again, we've got this picture of Hosea's family as a picture of Israel. Right? And so what we're seeing in chapter 2 is a deeper dive into the individual sins that Israel has been guilty of committing, why God's judgment has come. And the first one we just read is the sin of idolatry. Israel was practicing idolatry, and that's what he was just getting at in these verses. They'd created these statues of other gods, and so during times of famine and during times of drought, the Bible records that the Israelites would pray to those gods, those false gods. They prayed to Baal to get them through the famine. They prayed to Baal to get them through the drought. They should have been praying to God, but they weren't, and so they were guilty of idolatry. Second sin that Hosea tells us they were guilty of is the sin of ungratefulness. And the second part here of verse 5 says, "She said, 'I will go after my lovers.'" Skip to verse 8. "She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine and oil, who lavished on her the silver and gold which they used for Baal." So what we've got here is this picture of ungratefulness that God has been giving the increase to the nation, and when that happens, when the rains come, when the crops increase and the people are excited about that, they go and they give credit to Baal. They pray to Baal and they thank Baal for giving that, when of course that came from God. We went over this sort of concept here about where these things actually come from pretty recently. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6, Paul said, "I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow." James chapter 1, verse 17, "Every good and perfect gift is from above." And so what we learn from these two verses is this truth that God is the one who always gives the increase. All right, if you've got some increase, it's because of God. God is the one who gave that to you. Every blessing that we have comes from God. The Israelites instead were attributing those blessings to pagan gods, and the one true God was obviously very upset about that. The third sin that we see Israel indulging in here in Hosea 2 is the sin of hypocrisy. Verse 11, I will stop all her celebrations, her yearly festivals, her new moons, her Sabbath days, all her appointed festivals. So what we've got going on here is that they're worshiping Baal, we know that, but they're still worshiping God at the same time, right? They've got one foot back in the Old Testament times, in the Old Covenant, still going through the motions of doing these festivals that were required, still going through the motions of Judaism, if you will, but they've got another foot firmly planted in Baal worship also. And so the bottom line here is that God says that's not okay. Right? We can fall into this trap today of saying, well, I'm going to church on Sunday, I pray to God through the week, and so I'm good. I'm going to do some worldly stuff on top of that. But then we wind up with one foot in the Bible just like the Israelites were, and one foot in the world just like the Israelites were, and that is absolutely problematic. Any idolatry in our lives is problematic. If we need something to compare that to, I'd ask you the question, if a man is faithful to his wife 95% of the time, what is he? He's 100% unfaithful, right? It's the same way with God. That's why God uses this picture of spiritual adultery to be able to show how he feels about idolatry. So we've got this, again, just like we did with chapter 1, we have this picture of judgment. We have good reason for it, and he explains it, and it's a pretty harsh thing to read through. But also like with chapter 1, in chapter 2, after God works through all of that, he shows us this coming restoration. So before he's talking about or showing us that God is a God of justice, but here in chapter 2 we see God is indeed still a loving God in addition to being a God of justice. And so we already have this picture of restoration given to us in chapter 1, but kind of the cool part in chapter 2, we're getting more into the metaphor of the misbehaving people as Israel. And so when we see restoration shown in chapter 2, we've got this picture of God like romantically wooing a woman, right? Wooing her to come back. So God doesn't force the nation to come back when it's the time of restoration. He woos her to come back. It's pretty neat. Verse 14, he says, I am now going to allure her. He doesn't force the nation to return. He allures the nation. Verse 15, I will give, he says. Verses 16 to 17, I will remove. God makes the idolatry end. Verses 21 and 22, God says, I will respond to the nation. So the nation is going to want to return to God, and God is going to respond by opening up the floodgates of heaven, and rain will come and increase will come. God will respond. And then in verse 23, he says, I will plant. So there's this wonderful picture here of God sowing his people into the land like a farmer sows crops. Judgment, the sin is great, but this picture of restoration is even more beautiful, and we have to understand one as we look at the other. There's a sweet time of restoration that we're looking forward to seeing come true. Now that brings us to chapter 3. Pretty short chapter here. I'm just going to read the whole thing, and we'll talk about it. The Lord said to me, go show your love to your wife again. Though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress, love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a lethek of barley. Then I told her, you are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will behave the same way toward you. For the Israelites will live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones, without ephod or household gods. Afterward, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessings in the last days. And so what we see here in chapter 3, we see God telling Hosea to perform another action sermon. It started out in chapter 1, and now we've got another one in chapter 3, and I think this one must have been every bit as humbling for Hosea as the command in chapter 1 was. So Hosea goes back and he purchases back his wayward wife. And he pays, it said, 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a lethek of barley. Different translations have some different monetary amounts, but essentially this is about half the cost of a slave at the time. This was not a big price to pay. This was cheap. And so what Hosea is showing us, or what God is telling us here, is that Israel had cheapened herself because of her idolatry. So we've got in here this, again, prophecy about a rejected Israel. It hadn't happened at the time this was written. We know this comes to pass. But it's amazing what all is in here, because it's really convicting when you see all these pieces come together. If you remember last week when we were introducing the first chapter of 1 Samuel, we talked about the history there and how while they were a tribal society, the people wanted a king, but they wanted a man as king. God wanted him to be their king, but the people said, no, we want a man to be our king. And so God relented and said, fine, if that's what you want, then that's what he gave them. And he raised up Saul to be their king. Well, fast forward to the time of Jesus, and the people didn't want a king anymore. Right? They were done with that. What did the people say to Pilate when Jesus was being tried? There were accusations. Right? John chapter 19, verse 15. They said, we have no king but Caesar. And so yet again, God gives the people what they want. In 70 AD, Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is destroyed. There has been no king from that nation ever since. And so we see that prophesied right here in Hosea chapter 3, verse 4. For the Israelites will live many days without king. It says we're in that time right now. That's going on right now. That started in 70 AD. And it says they'll live many days without king or prince. This is relevant too because when the temple was destroyed, when Jerusalem was destroyed, all the census records were destroyed along with it. And so today there are many, many people in the world who can trace their lineage back, and they know that they are from the line of Israel. They know that they're Jewish, but there is nobody who has any kind of records to be able to prove that they are from the line of David. So there are Jewish people all over, and there's no king right now on the throne in Jerusalem, and there is no one who knows their lineage well enough to be able to claim they are from the line of David and say they are a rightful prince. The Israelites will live many days without king or prince. That's the prophecy. It says without sacrifice. Of course, once the temple is destroyed, the people have not been able to make any sacrifices. When it says also without ephod, that was something that a priest would wear as part of the ceremony for sacrificing, among other things. But again, temple's been destroyed. That whole thing has been stopped since 70 AD, and so there's no high priest anymore to wear the ephod. There's no place to make a sacrifice anymore because the temple has been destroyed. But look at the book of Hebrews says that Jesus is our high priest, that his sacrifice was sufficient for us for all times. And so God had put an end to the Israelites continuing with the sacrifices, continuing to have their own high priests after he had already given us Jesus. He put an end to that. And so it says right here in this prophecy, it's going to be many days without these things. It's absolutely amazing. So there is this rejection of Israel that's prophesied here all throughout Hosea chapters 1 through 3. But again, as with the previous chapter, the Bible says it will not be like this forever. There is a coming restoration. If you remember, we just finished up Romans not too long ago. In Romans chapter 11 especially, we dove into this. I think we spent 2 or 3 weeks looking at this, and we saw how the Israelites had strayed. We saw how God disciplined them. We saw that there was always this remnant that was maintained, and there is a promise of a return. It's a promise of restoration. God has some amazing plans in the future for the Israelites. They're going to return to the Lord. It's prophesied right here in verse 5 and in other places during the Bible. And we triangulate the timing here. We know that's not going to be something that happens until the tribulation. All right, so that is Hosea chapters 1 through 3. And so the question is, what do we do with that? Right? Because it's kind of a neat story. It's a pretty uncomfortable story. But what should we today do with what we just worked through? And so I would say there's three things primarily that I'd like us to walk away from here appreciating. And one, there's a lot of history in here that we just read. All right, and that history is interesting. It's part of God's greater unbroken story, and it's good for us to know that history, but that history can also be a source of great faith for us. Because remember, when this was written, there's prophecy after prophecy that Hosea writes down. All of that was looking to the future. None of those things had been fulfilled when this was written down. But here we are today, being able to look back at history, being able to look back at the scripture that was written later, and we saw these things come true. Long time, generations after Hosea had written what he had written. It's pretty amazing. But then also, even better, we find ourselves today in this amazing time in life where we can look back and we see, yeah, God had made these things come true. But now, 1948, what happened? Israel became a nation again. And so we've got this promise of restoration. I don't believe that's happened fully yet because they haven't recognized Jesus as the Messiah like God said they will. That's a thing to come. But look, almost 2,000 years elapsed between the time when they were scattered and they came back together to be a nation again. And so I honestly believe what we are seeing here is the very beginnings, the foundation of that future prophecy that's going to be fulfilled. We know this story. We can look around the world around us and we see God's plans playing out right before our very eyes. This can give us a tremendous amount of faith. Second takeaway I think we should get from this is we have to understand God is a jealous God. And this can kind of give us pause a little bit because we normally think of jealousy as just being a sinful or a bad thing. But I guess if you really look at the definition of jealousy, it can either mean a great zeal or it can mean a great envy. So there's a good kind of jealousy and there's a bad kind of jealousy. Exodus chapter 20, verse 5, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. And this statement and this theme gets repeated again and again elsewhere in the Bible. And so when it's talking about God, jealousy, it's always talking about the good kind. It's talking about this great zeal that God has. And so the implication is something that we've already touched on, but it's worth kind of going over again, and that's that God is not happy when we make idols out of things. This is not a benign thing. Sometimes today we fall into the trap of saying, well, I just check the block, man. I go to church, I read my Bible, I pray, whatever, and so we think as long as we've got one foot firmly rooted in here in this book or in this building, then we can put the other foot wherever we want. We've just learned from Hosea, it is not a good thing to do. We need to have both feet firmly planted in this book. We need to have both of our feet firmly planted in this building and nowhere else because God is a jealous God. Third, this is the last point, we've got to recognize that idolatry is serious stuff. I think especially today we need to recognize this. Back in the time of Hosea and the time of Moses, well, even they ran amok, but I think idolatry was taken a lot more seriously than it is today. But let me ask you this. When we started this out in chapter 1, and I read the first part of this to you, and we read about Hosea having to marry a prostitute and everything that happened there, did that make you cringe a little bit? It does me. Right? When I read this, I think that's pretty cringy. I don't look forward to coming up here and talking about that. Right? I'm surely there's some other nicer, happier things we can talk about in the Bible. But look, we need to talk about this for two reasons. One, it's in the Bible. But two, I think God gave it to us because we don't have a proper view of idolatry. And so that's why he gave us this picture. And so if we were to look at it from another angle, these are the 10 commandments, and you know these. Number 7, do not commit adultery. All right, and I think for every single person in this room, there is no question that adultery is problematic. We naturally cringe when we hear about someone we know, someone we're close to, getting wrapped up in the sin of idolatry. We are hardwired to be kind of disgusted by this one. And we should be. It's a sin. All right, that's number 7 on the 10 commandments. But look at number 1 and number 2. The first 2 commandments of the 10 commandments are about idolatry. 20% of the 10 commandments cover this problem. I'm not saying God put them in order of importance, but it can't escape our notice that the first 2 we read are all about this thing. And so I think our challenge should be today in 2022 here in America, we're all very convinced of the seriousness of number 7 here. But we've got to understand idolatry, we should be convicted of that being a problem twice as much. The truth of the matter is God used this Hosea example. He used the lesser sin to illustrate the greater sin. He used adultery to illustrate idolatry. And if you're like me, living in today's world, in my mind, it was kind of the other way around. Adultery seems a whole lot worse to me than idolatry. But there you go. This is a lesson we need to learn from Hosea, I think. We read about spiritual idolatry and Hosea marrying a prostitute, and we cringe. And look, we should cringe at that. It's awful. But idolatry should make us cringe even more. This is very, very serious stuff. And so quickly address what would that look like today, and we'll wrap up this message here. People don't typically bow down in front of golden calves anymore. Some people, I'm sure, do, but that's not typically what things look like. But idolatry is alive and well today. We still do this. God warns us not to. Idolatry is any time we put something else above God, something else that we make more important than God. So maybe you're not bowing down in front of a golden calf statue, but there are many, many people around us who do bow down before the altar of money. They bow down before the altar of success at work. You can make an idol out of anything. James chapter 4, verses 4 through 5 makes this absolutely clear to us and even uses the imagery of Hosea. He says, "You adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world means enmity against God? Or do you think Scripture says without reason that he jealously longs for the Spirit he has caused to dwell in us?" A couple verses in James, the entire message of Hosea chapters 1 through 3. 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 to 17. "Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever." We need to be convicted about the seriousness of idolatry, every bit as much as we're convicted about the seriousness of adultery. It is no coincidence that God tells us 8 times in the Bible, "Be holy, for I am holy." That's as far as we're going to take Hosea today. Lord willing, we'll meet together next week and we'll continue. If you want to kind of read ahead, that will be especially good for this series because we're not going to read every word. Next week, we're going to cover chapters 4 through 10. So if you got a background, that'll help, but we'll still cover the main things that he's talking about in there during that time. So now before we head home, we'd like to have a time of communion this morning. So if the gentlemen who are helping out will please come forward, we will do that.